Why did Israel launch the biggest attack of this entire war, just 9 hours after the ceasefire was announced? Not days after, not weeks after, 9 hours. But here's the part that will change how you see this entire story. Those 9 hours of quiet were not peace. They were not restraint. They were not respect for the deal. Those 9 hours were Israel getting ready, loading the jets, coordinating the targets, preparing over 100 strike locations simultaneously across an entire country. The Israeli military carried out over 100 airstrikes across Lebanon, Beirut, the Bekaa Valley, and the south, the largest coordinated strike of the entire war. 254 people killed, over 2,100 wounded. Al Jazeera. You do not build that operation in 9 hours. That was planned, loaded, waiting. The ceasefire was announced at 3 a.m. Families in Beirut packed their bags. Children were lifted into cars. People who had not slept in a real bed for months were finally going home. And at noon, while those families were still on the road, the sky broke open. The silence was never peace. It was the calm before the biggest storm Lebanon has ever seen in this war. And the man who ordered it had welcomed that same ceasefire just hours before. There is only one explanation for that, and it goes back 40 years. Drop your country below. Don't you dare scroll. This video is about one man's desperation. Not Iran's desperation, not Hezbollah's desperation, not even America's, Netanyahu's. And to understand why he is desperate, you need to understand what he actually wanted from this war. Because it was never what he told you it was. Yes, he talked about nuclear weapons. Yes, he talked about Hezbollah rockets. Yes, he warned about Iran's missiles for 4 decades. But underneath all of that, there was one singular, specific goal. Regime change, remove the Islamic Republic, bring chaos to Tehran, and hope or engineer the return of a government friendly to Israel. Something closer to the era of the Shah. A secular, Western-aligned Iran that would not fund Hezbollah, would not support Hamas, and would not point missiles at Tel Aviv. Top Trump aides reportedly told Trump before the war that Netanyahu's regime change forecast was described as BS and farcical. The Times of Israel. They were right. The bombs fell. The supreme leader died. And what rose in Tehran was not celebration. Not pro-Western crowds filling the streets welcoming a new dawn. What rose was fury, national pride, defiance. And Netanyahu, standing in his war room, realized something catastrophic. His plan had failed. Now, with a ceasefire he never wanted, a Strait of Hormuz that keeps closing again, and 254 Lebanese civilians dead on the day peace was declared, one question defines this entire moment. Is Netanyahu deliberately trying to destroy this ceasefire before it can take hold? Let's find out. To understand what is happening today, in Lebanon, in the Strait of Hormuz, in Washington, you need to go back. Not to last week, not to February, back 40 years. Because what looks like chaos right now is actually a very old script, being run by a man who has been rehearsing it his entire political life. And the most chilling part, he came closer to pulling it off than anyone ever expected. In 1992, a young Benjamin Netanyahu stood before the Israeli parliament and made a prediction. Iran would have a nuclear weapon within 3 to 5 years. That was 1992. He said the same thing in 1995, in 2002, in 2012, famously standing at the United Nations General Assembly, holding up a cartoon diagram of a bomb with a red line drawn across it. Act now, he said, before it is too late. Every single time, the deadline passed. Iran did not get the bomb, but Netanyahu never stopped warning, never stopped pushing, never stopped lobbying Washington to treat Iran as an existential emergency requiring immediate action. Why? Because for Netanyahu, Iran is not just a military threat. Iran is the engine behind every enemy Israel faces. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen. Destroy the Iranian government, and you do not just win one war. You reshape the entire Middle East in a single move. That has always been the vision, the grand strategy, the 40-year plan, and in February 2026, after decades of pressure, lobbying, intelligence sharing, and relentless political maneuvering, he finally got America to pull the trigger. The US and Israel struck Iran on February 28th. Hezbollah entered the war in retaliation for Israel's killing of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, on the very first day of the strikes. Al Jazeera. Netanyahu had his war. Now came the part he had promised everyone. The part he had bet his entire legacy on. The Iranian people rising up. The Islamic Republic collapsing from within. A new government emerging. A new Iran. It never happened. Instead, Iran's military released a statement saying the war had forced America and Israel to accept Iran's proposed conditions and surrender. News Nation, surrender. That is what Iran called it. And the worst part, from Netanyahu's perspective, is that they were not entirely wrong. Trump announced a ceasefire. 2 weeks, paused the bombing, talk in Islamabad. The supreme leader was gone, but the Islamic Republic was still standing. The Revolutionary Guards were still armed. The population had not revolted. The government had not collapsed. And Iran was already celebrating in state media. Netanyahu's 40-year plan, the plan that finally dragged a US president into striking Iran, had not delivered what he promised. A desperate man with a failing plan is the most dangerous kind of leader in the world. Remember that. Everything that follows flows from that single fact. When Pakistan's Prime Minister walked to the microphone at 3 a.m. on April 8th and announced an immediate ceasefire effective everywhere, including Lebanon, Netanyahu had a choice. Accept it. Let the region breathe. Allow diplomacy to do what bombs could not, or find a way to keep the pressure alive. He chose pressure. Netanyahu's office issued a statement welcoming the ceasefire with Iran, but buried inside it was one sentence that changed everything. The 2-week ceasefire does not include Lebanon. The Times of Israel. This directly contradicted Pakistan's prime minister, the man who brokered the entire deal. It contradicted Iran's understanding of the agreement, and it set off a chain reaction that nearly destroyed the ceasefire within hours of its birth. But now, here is the insider detail that most coverage completely missed. Think about what it takes to launch over 100 simultaneous airstrikes across an entire country. Pilots need to be briefed, coordinates need to be locked and verified, jets need to be armed and fueled, strike teams need to be positioned across multiple fronts, Beirut, the south, the Bekaa Valley, all at the same time. Military planners will tell you, an operation of that scale and coordination takes days to build, not hours, which means the strikes that hit Lebanon at noon on April 8th were not a reaction to anything that happened that morning. They were already built, already loaded, already waiting. The 9 hours of silence after the ceasefire announcement were not Israel showing restraint. They were Israel finishing its final preparations. A Beirut-based journalist covering the strikes warned that by launching the largest attacks of the war, immediately after the US and Iran reached a tentative agreement, Israel was attempting to create conditions that make a durable ceasefire impossible. And when those preparations were complete, Israeli strikes hit several dense commercial and residential areas in central Beirut without warning, hours after the ceasefire was announced. Lebanon's national news agency reported airstrikes hit at least 5 different neighborhoods in Beirut's central and coastal areas simultaneously. PBS. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun condemned the surge in violence and called it a massacre. CBC News. UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk responded, "The scale of the killing and destruction in Lebanon today is nothing short of horrific. Such carnage, within hours of agreeing to a ceasefire with Iran, defies belief." Haaretz. Families who had packed their bags at 3 a.m., who had put their children in cars and started driving home for the first time in months, turned around on the highway. One man named Fadi, 35 years old, had prepared to head back to the southern city of Nabatea before Netanyahu's comments stopped him. "But we'll be targeted if we go home," he said. PBS. And this, critically, is not new behavior. This is a documented pattern. Israel violated the previous Lebanon ceasefire, the one from November 2024, with more than 10,000 air and land attacks over the first year alone. The United Nations described it as a total disregard of the ceasefire agreement. Common dreams. Israel did the same in Gaza, where hundreds of Palestinians were killed after a ceasefire began in October 2025. Common dreams. So when Netanyahu says ceasefire, understand precisely what that word means in practice. It means ceasefire for me, nowhere else. This is the part nobody in mainstream media is connecting directly, because the next piece, what Iran did in response, is what is now threatening your fuel prices, your food costs, and the global economy. Stay with me. Iran was watching all of this unfold in real time. They had accepted a deal. Their foreign minister had signed off. Their parliament speaker had been at the negotiating table. Pakistan had announced on their behalf that Lebanon was explicitly included in the ceasefire terms. And then they turned on their televisions and watched Beirut burn. The response came fast, and it hit the world exactly where it hurts most. Iran's state-run Fars news agency reported that the country was closing the Strait of Hormuz less than 24 hours after the ceasefire was announced, directly citing Israeli violations in Lebanon as the reason. Wow, 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 wow. Now, if you do not fully understand why this one decision sends panic through every government on Earth, let me give you the number. 20%. That is the share of all globally traded oil that passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Before the war, between 100 and 120 commercial vessels transited the strait every single day. Wikipedia. The closure has been described as the largest disruption to global energy supply since the 1970s oil crisis, the largest in the history of the global oil market. Brent crude surged past $100 per barrel and peaked at $126 per barrel. Your fuel prices, your food prices, your electricity bills, the cost of everything that travels by ship. And here is the expert detail almost no outlet reported clearly. 2 oil tankers were initially allowed through the strait after obtaining permission from Iran, but further passage was then halted directly because of Israel's fresh strikes on Lebanon. NBC News. Iran was not closing the strait randomly. Iran was sending a signal. Precise, deliberate, unmistakable. You bomb Lebanon after our ceasefire. We close the strait. Those are the consequences. Iran's parliament speaker put it in writing for the entire world to read. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf accused the U.S. of violating 3 clauses of Iran's 10-point ceasefire plan, including the attacks on Lebanon. Al Jazeera. He wrote, "The deep historical distrust we hold toward the United States stems from its repeated violations of all forms of commitments, a pattern that has regrettably been repeated once again." Iran's military went further still. They released a statement warning, "With distrust toward the American and Zionist enemies, we monitor all their movements in the region." News Nation. "And in the event of another mistake by them, we will respond in a more destructive and deadlier manner than before." And Iran's foreign minister went directly after America's credibility on the world stage. Abbas Araghchi posted publicly, "The world sees the massacres in Lebanon. The ball is in the U.S. court, and the world is watching." NBC4 Washington. Now connect the dots. Netanyahu bombed Lebanon 9 hours after the ceasefire, using a strike operation that was already built before the deal existed. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz in response, threatening the global oil supply. And the ceasefire that Trump had declared a historic victory was now hanging by a single thread. One man pulled all of these dominoes over, and he is sitting in Tel Aviv calling it justified. The White House had a serious problem on the morning of April 8th. Trump had walked out and declared the ceasefire a historic victory. His press secretary told the world that America had achieved and exceeded every military objective in just 38 days. And then, in real time, while those words were still echoing, the ceasefire began unraveling. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stood at a Pentagon briefing and declared, "The strait is open." Joint Chiefs Chairman Dan Kane, asked directly whether the strait was open right now, said, "I believe so, based on the diplomatic negotiation." CNBC. At that exact same moment, Iranian state media was reporting the strait was closed. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt called reports of the closure false, while simultaneously saying any closure would be completely unacceptable. CBS News. You cannot call something false and unacceptable at the same time. One of those words has to be wrong. The shipping industry saw through it immediately. A shipping executive with vessels currently stuck in the Persian Gulf told CNBC directly, "We have no information about how we could transit the Strait of Hormuz during the ceasefire. We are not in contact with Iranian authorities. The most important thing for us is the safety of our crew members." CNBC. Overall traffic through the waterway had not picked up beyond the slow trickle seen throughout the war. Industry analysts said many ship owners would wait several days to ensure the ceasefire actually holds before committing their vessels. CBC News. Meanwhile, what was America's actual position on Israel bombing Lebanon on the day of the ceasefire? Trump said Lebanon was not part of the deal because of Hezbollah, but added it would get taken care of. CBC News. Vance tried to frame Israel's 100-strike assault as a misunderstanding, while saying the Israelis had offered to check themselves a little bit in Lebanon to help ensure negotiations succeed. Haaretz. Check themselves. That was the phrase used, after 254 people were killed. And Hezbollah made its own position completely clear. A Hezbollah official told the Associated Press, "We have not announced our adherence to the ceasefire since the Israelis are not adhering to it." Euronews. Here is the full strategic picture that nobody is drawing clearly enough. Netanyahu wants Lebanon to keep burning, because as long as Lebanon burns, Hezbollah keeps firing. As long as Hezbollah keeps firing, Israel has justification to stay inside Lebanon. And as long as Israel stays in Lebanon, any Iran deal that does not address Lebanon will eventually collapse, giving Netanyahu another opening to push for something far bigger. The critical question now, according to analysts on the ground, is whether the Israel-Hezbollah front will even be discussed in the upcoming negotiations between Iran and the US in Islamabad. Al Jazeera. If it is not, this ceasefire has a hole in it large enough to drive an entire war through. And Netanyahu knows exactly where that hole is. He put it there himself. Comment right now. Do you think America will pressure Israel to stop bombing Lebanon during these 2 weeks of negotiations? Yes or no? Let's see what this audience actually thinks. So let's bring this all the way back to where we started. 9 hours. That is the number that defines this entire story. 9 hours between a ceasefire announcement and the biggest bombing of the war. 9 hours that were not silence, but preparation. 9 hours that exposed everything about what one man truly wants from this conflict. Netanyahu got his war. He got America to strike Iran. He watched the supreme leader fall. He achieved in 38 days what he had lobbied for across 4 decades. And still, the Islamic Republic stands. The Strait of Hormuz keeps closing. Hezbollah is still firing. The grand plan, regime change, a new Iran, a reshaped Middle East, never came. What came instead was a ceasefire Netanyahu never wanted. A 2-week pause he could not stop, but refused to fully honor. And 254 Lebanese civilians killed on the single day the world thought the guns had gone quiet. The first round of ceasefire negotiations is scheduled this Saturday in Islamabad, led by Vice President J.D. Vance, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner. CNBC, 2 weeks. That is all the time the world has. 2 weeks to turn a fragile, bullet-riddled pause into something real. While one man is doing everything in his power to ensure it falls apart before it even finds its footing. Watch the Islamabad talks closely. Watch whether Lebanon gets included in the negotiating framework or gets left outside again. Watch whether the Strait of Hormuz stays open or closes for the 3rd time. Because what happens in these 2 weeks will define the next decade of this region. And Fadi, the 35-year-old man sitting in Sidon with his bags still packed, unable to go home, is waiting for an answer that only these negotiations can give him. He deserves one. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Netanyahu will let this ceasefire survive the full 2 weeks? Or will he find a way, anyway, to keep this war alive before Islamabad even begins? Comment your answer below. And if this breakdown gave you something the mainstream news did not, hit that like button. Because real analysis like this only reaches people when you help it travel. New videos covering the Islamabad negotiations are coming as events develop. Subscribe now, because the next 48 hours will tell us everything. This ceasefire is alive, barely, by a thread, and that thread has a name.